Russian underwater and space vehicles are terrifying Western countries. But first things first, let's start with space. Russia has long been engaged in individual anti-satellite weapons designed to destroy individual spacecraft. But now, according to officials from the Pentagon and the State Department, it has decided not to deal with small things anymore. The fact that Russia, on April 26, 2024, vetoed at the UN a Japanese-American draft resolution on the non-deployment of weapons in space has once again fueled talk of our country's readiness to launch satellite fighters with nuclear warheads on board. Recall that in mid-February of this year, a Republican congressman from Ohio, and at the same time the chairman of the Executive Committee on Intelligence, Mike Turner, said in his social network that Russia could gain destabilizing superiority in orbit. This will happen if the Russians implement their own plans to put into orbit inspection satellites, or satellite fighters, as they are also called, with small nuclear charges on board. And this one is supposedly in the final testing stage and will be realized in the near future. His words instantly took the social networks and the media by storm. It came to the point that allegedly because of this unexpected danger, the American president gathered as much as a whole National Security Council. But the topic didn't take off. Maybe the danger was overestimated at that time. Or maybe people are so tired of such scary stories that they cannot react properly to such space threats beyond the atmosphere. Sometimes the problem of nuclear weapons in orbit was revisited by specialized specialists, but more often than not it was to remind about the American nuclear tests in space. As part of the Starfish Prime program back in 1962, in that glorious era of the first space flights, there was much more space in orbit. And as a result of rash and poorly calculated actions of the Americans, several satellites that were flying in the test area over the Pacific Islands failed. They were killed by powerful electromagnetic radiation. This is how radiation and EMP propagation looks like in case of a series of nuclear explosions in Earth orbit. Now, 60 years later, similar attempts are being made to implicate Russia. In particular, high-ranking U.S. politicians in May again talked about the fact that our country is allegedly ready to break another fundamental treaty on non-deployment of nuclear weapons in orbit and space. U.S. fears are quite understandable. They have already so many times without the slightest shame let the fundamental treaties on global security, such as the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, go under the knife, that they realize that sooner or later they will pull the same trick. Now, the orbital nuclear weapons of the Russian Air Force in orbit have been spoken of as a direct and obvious threat. According to some reports, the Americans suspect the Cosmos 2553 spacecraft of being used as an orbital military laboratory. Officially, it is claimed to be an optical reconnaissance satellite, but NASA claims that the peculiarity of its orbital motion reflects some other global and strategic goals. Warzen quoted Under Secretary of State for Arms Control, Deterrence, and Stability Mallory Stewart as saying, "The U.S. government is strongly concerned that Russia already has some sort of secret testbed in space as part of its development of an anti-satellite weapon with a nuclear payload in orbit. We're not talking about weapons that could be used to attack people or cause structural damage on Earth. Our analysts estimate that detonating a nuclear charge at a specific location in orbit would render lower Earth orbit unusable for satellites for a sufficiently long period of time." His colleague from the U.S. Foreign Policy Department was supported by Deputy Secretary of Defense for Space Policy John Plump. "This good man can't eat as they advocate demilitarization of space." To quote, "We are most concerned that Russia continues to develop these weapons at a rapid pace. And unless we can convince it to stop these dangerous endeavors, it will eventually launch nuclear weapons into space. Indiscriminate weapons that have no national boundaries and make no distinction between military, civilian, satellite, or commercial satellites." End quote. It is humbling to see such concern by top U.S. officials for peaceful space overhead. Not only that half of the so-called commercial satellites of the USA are dual-purpose vehicles, there is hardly anyone who doubts that if the United States had everything in order with its own developments, surely no restrictions would have been out of the question. So, of course, we are not dealing with the concern of our overseas comrades for world peace, but with a banal attempt to simply stall for time. But it didn't work out, and now the US is thinking whether Moscow has decided to make a grand bluff, feeding disinformation to various American insiders, or whether something is really flying in orbit there, and this something is bothering the entire American power establishment in a very unpleasant way. Well, now let's move on to Poseidon. Foreign media showed the launch of Poseidon, and our nuclear drone is again in the center of attention of Western experts and military, especially British. This is one of the operational underwater vehicles on the basis of which the status 6, the the future Poseidon strategic underwater drone was created. The Poseidon strategic underwater drone, which still has a kind of semi-legal status in our nuclear triad, is referred to in the European press as an immoral and indiscriminate weapon. Translated from the propagandistic vernacular, this usually means that such weapons are actively disliked by the local military because a lot of additional trouble and they cannot parry such a threat. And although in the West some hotheads even try to deny the very existence of Poseidon, in April 1924, large spreads devoted to the mysterious Russian system placed many Western publications, including non-military topics. For example, the famous American financial newsletter The Wall Street Journal ran a whole 6-minute movie about the Russian torpedo of the apocalypse. The main expert there was an aunt who looked like a ruddy housewife, and a number of faceless experts from various analytical centers, which on the fat body of the American agitprop spread like mushrooms after the rain. In the same video, there is footage of alleged training launches of a Russian strategic drone. The general refrain of the narrative has long become formulaic and follows one clear algorithm. The Russians have no technology, or rather they do, but it is outdated. Sanctions will strangle the project, and if you don't believe it, it's all propaganda and Russian narratives. But even if they do, it's bound to be something immoral and villainous that will again prevent liberal society from building a rules-based world order. Here, by the way, is the gigantic special-purpose nuclear submarine BS-329 Belgorod of Project 09852, the carrier of most of Russia's promising underwater drones. Frankly, it wasn't even clear why they were so excited. As early as last summer, when the nuclear submarine Belgorod left for a test of the vehicle, after which no official reports followed, NATO began to merrily bury the project without having, however, a single real reason. On the contrary, any observant person could notice that if strategic weapons, for example, the same daggers, zircons, and sarmatians, in such a stage of readiness disappear from the information field, then, most likely, it is a sure sign that it has already been put into service and is in combat service. More clarity on the whole matter was provided by Admiral Sir Ben Key, commander of the Royal Navy, or as he calls it, Britain's first Sea Lord, in an interview with the Daily Telegraph. Following Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's statement on the militarization of British industry, the Admiral named new maritime threats, including Russia's Yazanem, Losherik, and Poseidon nuclear submarines. The latter two, according to Sir Ben Key, will enter service this summer. By the way, we have already made a material about the Losherik, and he after repairs will really join the fleet at this time. As for Poseidon, the British Admiral obviously has some intelligence of his own, including murky footage of alleged drone launches, which was included in a large pretentious report by the American media giant Wall Street Journal. This, by the way, is how the Belgorod boat and its underwater vehicles look through the eyes of foreign experts. We say very little about the Poseidon underwater drone, so we have to turn to Western sources. Even if they lie about the drone, at least they will show fresh satellite images. The last official reports on the project by the Russian media come in August last year, when Western intelligence agencies were the first to spread the message that the carrier boat Belgorod has gone on sea trials of underwater vehicles. And now there is a new burst of information activity in 2024. Most likely, the test cycle has been passed, and if we believe the commander of the British Navy, interesting news about the project awaits us all in the summer.